Buffalo went under a driving ban at 8 o'clock that night, so the streets didn't belong to anybody anymore. Delia Mercer walked down Delaware Avenue anyway, 27 years old and 7.5 months along, wearing a faded gray-blue custodial uniform and her dead husband's torn windbreaker. Everything she owned fit in one canvas bag. She had $3.40 in her pocket. Then a young woman stepped out of the whiteout ahead of her, barefoot in the snow, in striped pajamas with a shearling coat thrown crooked over one shoulder and a hospital band still fastened around her wrist. The young woman looked straight at her and started to cry. "Mom, I've been looking for you. Why did you leave me so long?" Delia didn't get the chance to say she wasn't anyone's mother, because the girl went down in her arms, cold as river ice. No phone, no cars, not one, for 40 minutes. So Delia took off the last coat she owned, wrapped it around a stranger, lifted that stranger onto her back, and started walking north toward Fire Station 9, because the streets of that city were the only thing her husband had left her besides the coat. She didn't know who the girl was. She didn't know that 3 blocks ahead a pair of headlights was about to find her down on her knees in the snow, and that the man who'd step out of that car was a man this city lowers its voice to talk about. She only knew one thing. If she stopped walking, the girl on her back wouldn't see morning. If a story about the people we walk past every day means something to you, give it a like, share it with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe so the next one finds you. Now let's go back to that avenue, back to the snow, and to the moment a woman with nothing left decided she wasn't going to walk away. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, before darkness had fully settled and while snow was only beginning to drift sparsely onto the metal roof of the rooming house on the east side of the city, Delia Mercer stood outside the door to her room and watched the locksmith finish installing the new lock. The landlord stood nearby with one hand braced against the wall, avoiding her eyes. She didn't argue. She didn't ask why it had to be today, didn't remind him that she had asked for one more week, and didn't say that he had promised. She only stood there with both hands resting over her belly, in the unconscious way pregnant women often hold themselves, then asked a single question, her voice so calm that it made the landlord himself uncomfortable. She asked if she could go inside and collect her things. He nodded, told her she had 15 minutes, then walked to the end of the hall to smoke, probably so he wouldn't have to watch. Delia stepped into the room where she had lived through the past fall and winter. It was small, with only one window, and the damp smell from the north wall had never gone away. She didn't pause to look around. She opened the closet, took out 2 uniforms, 3 sweaters, and a pair of thick socks, then rolled them as tightly as she could so they would fit inside her cloth bag. She took her toothbrush, the bottle of vitamins a nurse at the free clinic had given her, and the one towel that was still usable. She did everything in a clear, orderly sequence, never stopping, never hesitating, as though she had packed this way many times in her life, and her body still remembered how, even if her mind had forgotten. Then she knelt, reached into the narrow space beneath the bed, and pulled out an old tin, the kind of cookie tin people gave one another during the holidays. She opened the lid. There was no money inside, no jewelry, nothing anyone would consider worth taking. There was only a paramedic identification card with worn corners bearing the name Owen Mercer, along with a photograph of him in uniform wearing the slightly stern expression she had always teased him about, calling it his identification card face. Beneath those lay a recent ultrasound image, shadowy and black and white, with a tiny form curled at its center. She looked at the 2 things for only a few seconds, then closed the lid and placed the tin in her bag. Owen had died several months earlier while responding to an accident on the highway. He had never reached the scene. They told her he hadn't had time to do anything at all, and she remembered nodding as though those words were meant to comfort her. Afterward, the insurance company sent a letter denying the claim, citing an error in the record from his shift that night. One small line of print she read over and over, without ever understanding. Then, 3 days after the funeral, before she had even put away her black dress, she learned that she was pregnant. He had never known. She fastened the bag, slung it over her shoulder, and stepped into the hallway. The landlord put out his cigarette, looked at her belly, then lowered his eyes to the floor. He said something about how he had to survive too, how the bank didn't wait for anyone, and Delia replied that she understood, her voice so gentle that it made him feel worse than he would have if she had shouted at him. She had taken only a few steps when he called after her. He asked her a question as though it had slipped out by accident, as though it had been waiting in his mind for a long time and had only now finally fallen free. He asked whether she knew who her husband still owed money to. Delia turned around. She said she didn't understand what he meant. The landlord looked at her for a moment, then shook his head, said it was nothing, and went back inside, closing the door behind him. Delia remained at the end of the hallway for several seconds, one hand tightening around the strap of her bag, waiting to see whether he would say anything more. He didn't. She descended the stairs, left the building, and the cold outside struck her face like an open hand. She had $3.40 in her pocket, and a night shift downtown beginning at 7 o'clock. She walked because bus fare was milk money. Along the way, a memory came without permission, as memories often did when she was most exhausted. It was Owen standing in the cramped kitchen of their old apartment, traces of dust from his shift still clinging to his hands, explaining what he called the first lesson they had taught him, and the only one he still remembered. Before bandaging anyone, he said, he always asked for their name first. People might forget where they hurt, but no one ever forgot what it felt like to be called by the right name. She had laughed at him then, and told him he sounded like someone in a movie. Walking along Delaware Avenue that afternoon, she didn't laugh anymore. A few miles south of where Delia was walking, in the part of the city where it stopped pretending to be respectable and began conducting its real business, a row of shipping warehouses stood along the water's edge. In the basement of warehouse number 4, 4 men stood around a wooden table, and none of them was sitting. The 5th man sat because his legs could no longer hold him. His name was Silvio. He worked in dispatch, and 3 days earlier, he had sold a shipping schedule to people on the other side of the river. The door opened. Massimo Ferraro walked in, and the entire basement fell silent in a way that existed only in places like that. A silence born not from fear of making a sound, but from fear of oneself. He was 34 years old, dressed in a dark wool coat with no tie, and a thin old scar marked his left cheekbone. He didn't look at Silvio right away. He removed his coat, smoothed the 2 sides, then hung it on the hook behind the door, slowly and carefully, like a man arriving home from work. The 4 men around the table watched every movement. They had seen this before, and they knew that the moment he hung up his coat was the moment they should fear most, because if he kept it on, it meant he intended to leave quickly. Massimo pulled out the chair across from Silvio and sat down. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask how much, who had paid him, or how many times he had done it. He only rested both elbows on the table, laced his fingers together, and asked how long Silvio had worked for him. Silvio swallowed hard. He said he had been there since Massimo's father was still alive. Massimo nodded very slightly, as though that was exactly the answer he had expected. Then he said that Silvio knew something many people outside those walls didn't know, which was that Massimo never shouted at anyone. His father had. He continued. His father had shouted constantly, and his father had also died earlier than he needed to. Silvio began to speak, his voice breaking as he said he had reasons, that there were debts he had to pay, that he would return everything. Massimo raised one finger. Only one. Silvio fell silent at once. Massimo took 2 things from his inside pocket and placed them neatly on the table, side by side, the way someone might set down 2 pieces on a chessboard. One was a thick envelope, the other was a one-way airline ticket. He said there was a flight at 6 o'clock the following morning. He said Silvio would board that flight, and he would be allowed to leave. Truly leave. No one would follow him. No one would ask after him. The money in the envelope was enough for him to begin again somewhere warmer than this city. Then Massimo paused. He looked at Silvio and lowered his voice another degree, speaking so softly that the 3 men nearest him had to tilt their heads to hear. He said that if Silvio was still in the city at 9 o'clock the next morning, he wouldn't search for Silvio anymore. He would search for the person who had paid him, and he would sit down with that person exactly as he was sitting there now. Then tell him that Silvio was the one who had given him the name. Silvio looked up. His face had gone white. He understood that what had been placed on the table wasn't a punishment. It was a way out, and if he didn't take it, that way out would close on its own and become something entirely different. Massimo rose. He took his coat from the hook, put it on, fastened the top button, and walked toward the door. No one in the basement said a word. Nothing broke. There wasn't a single loud sound, and that was what sent a deeper chill down the spines of the 4 men standing there than anything else could have. In the hallway leading back to street level, Nico Ostrowski was waiting with a phone in his hand. Nico had been with the Ferraro family for a long time long enough to be the only man who dared tell Massimo things he didn't want to hear. He said Uncle Ezra had called twice since that afternoon about Giada's paperwork, the provision naming Ezra as her godfather that Rosetta had placed in her will when the girl was still very young. Massimo opened the car door without turning around and told him it could wait until tomorrow. Then he settled into the back seat, took out his phone, and silenced it, because there was still a meeting that evening on the 30th floor of the tower on the avenue, a meeting he had already postponed twice and couldn't postpone again. The car rolled away from the warehouses and turned north toward downtown, toward the building where, that same evening, a woman was also making her weary way, except that she was walking, and she would enter through the back door. Delia reached the tower on the avenue at 10 minutes to 7, circled around to the rear entrance as she did every night, swiped her card, and changed in the small basement room, with its row of metal lockers and a mirror cracked at one corner. She put on her blue-gray uniform, tied back her hair, then pushed her cleaning cart into the freight elevator. Her assignment that evening was the main lobby and the 3 lower floors. The main lobby always came first because after 8 o'clock almost no one passed through it, and people didn't like seeing cleaning carts when they were leaving. She was mopping the center of the lobby, where the polished stone floor reflected the entire ceiling during the day, when the doors of the east elevator opened. The lobby fell silent, not the kind of silence that came when people stopped talking, but the kind that came when every voice dropped half a measure, and then suddenly found there was no need to speak at all. The 2 security guards behind the desk straightened. The receptionist, who had been arranging papers, lowered her hands. Delia didn't look up. She had worked there long enough to know that when the whole lobby went quiet like that, the best thing to do was lower her head and keep pushing the cart. 6 men stepped out of the elevator, moving as one, and the man at the front wore a dark wool coat with no tie. Delia pulled the cart to the right to clear their path, but the left wheel caught on the edge of the non-slip mat, and the cart jerked to a stop. The bottle of diluted cleaning solution on the upper shelf tipped over, rolled off, and its cap sprang open. Pale blue liquid spread across the stone floor, directly in the middle of the walkway, directly in front of the approaching men. Delia released the mop and bent down to seize the bottle. She apologized. She said it wasn't slippery and that she would clean it up immediately. She repeated herself because she thought they hadn't heard her the first time. The man in front stepped across the spill. He didn't stop, didn't go around it, and didn't frown. He didn't look down, and he didn't look at her. He crossed it the way someone might step over a patch of light on the floor, and the 5 men behind him followed. Not one of the 6 turned around. Delia remained on one knee on the stone floor, the bottle in her hand, and realized she was apologizing to empty air. Then the last man in the group took out his wallet without slowing down, removed a bill, and let it fall. The money landed at the edge of the spill, one corner soaking up the liquid. "For the trouble?" he said in an ordinary voice, neither contemptuous nor compassionate, the voice someone might use when paying for parking. He didn't look at her either. Delia stared at the bill worth $100 lying on the wet stone floor. She thought of the $3.40 in the pocket of her coat downstairs. She thought of the cloth bag inside the metal locker, containing everything she still possessed in the world. She thought about where she would sleep that night, and she had no answer. Then she picked up the money, rose, and hurried after them. She moved slowly because she couldn't run quickly anymore, one hand supporting the underside of her belly, while the other held the bill aloft. She called after them, saying, "Sir, you dropped this." By the second time she called out, she had reached the revolving door. Outside, a black car waited at the curb with its rear door already open. The man in the wool coat got in first. The man who had dropped the money followed him. The door closed with a solid, muted sound, and the car pulled away from the curb before Delia emerged from the turning glass. She stood beneath the awning as snow swept sideways across her face, her hand still raised with the money, as though she were waiting to speak in a room where no one remained. She lowered her hand. She went back inside, cleaned the spill, put the cart in order, then returned to the basement, opened her locker, and took out the tin. She folded the bill into quarters and placed it inside beside Owen's identification card. She didn't spend it. She couldn't explain to herself why she didn't. 20 minutes later, the night shift manager was waiting outside the changing room with the timesheet in her hand. She said this was the 3rd time that month, that the company had rules, and that she didn't enjoy doing this either. Delia asked whether it was because she had arrived 12 minutes late on Monday. The manager said it was. Delia nodded, removed her uniform, folded it, placed it on top of the locker, picked up her cloth bag, and left through the rear entrance. As she stepped onto the sidewalk of Delaware Avenue, the radio at the security desk was announcing that a citywide travel ban had just gone into effect, and beyond the doors, the streets were beginning to empty. The girl's weight fell against Delia so suddenly that she had to step back to keep her balance, and Delia's first instinct wasn't compassion. It was fear. She gently pushed the girl's shoulder away, retreated another half step, and wrapped one arm protectively around her belly, as every thought a woman walking alone on an empty street at night was forced to consider flashed through her mind. She thought it might be some kind of trick. She thought someone else might be standing nearby in the darkness behind the falling snow. She thought about how she couldn't run, couldn't fight, couldn't do anything at all, and that if something happened, she wouldn't be the only one who suffered. But the girl didn't cling to her. She slipped downward, landed on her knees in the snow, and collapsed there, both arms hanging loose, her head bowed forward, and Delia saw two things at once. The first was what looked like a thin plastic band around the girl's left wrist, the kind a hospital might place on someone, yellowed with age rather than newly fastened that day. The second was her bare feet. No socks, no shoes, nothing at all between her skin and the deep snow. And that skin had turned a color Delia had seen before and never wanted to see again. Her fear receded as swiftly as it had come. She stepped forward, knelt, and helped the girl sit with her back against Delia's legs. She called to her and asked if she could hear. The girl raised her head, and at that moment, when they looked directly at each other beneath the streetlight, Delia understood what this was. It wasn't alcohol. She had seen drunken people before. Drunken people looked into your eyes and laughed, or cursed, or collapsed completely. This was different. The girl's gaze drifted across Delia's face, passed beyond her shoulder, then slowly returned, a beat later than it should have, as though the image had been forced to travel a long and winding road before reaching the place where it belonged. Then the girl opened her mouth and repeated exactly what she had said before, almost word for word, with the same inflection and the same pauses for breath, asking why she had been gone so long. When she finished, she fell silent, and a little while later, she seemed ready to say it all again. Delia knew that loop. She had watched it through countless shifts at the rehabilitation center outside the city, the place where she had once worked and once loved, the place that had closed one summer and taken with it the certification she couldn't afford to renew. There had been people there even younger than this girl, and they repeated themselves the same way, their eyes drifting in the same way, calling strangers by the names of people who had died. And the first thing Delia had been taught there was never to argue. Don't say that isn't true. Don't say you're mistaken. Don't drag someone back toward a reality where they could no longer find the road home. So Delia didn't tell the girl that she wasn't anyone's mother. She lowered herself fully into the snow and endured the cold so that her face would be level with the girl's, because no one could comfort another human being from above. She took those frozen hands and held them between her own, then spoke slowly, separating every word, her voice steady and warm, as though she were telling a story to a child about to fall asleep. All right. It's all right. I'm here. The girl blinked. Then Delia said what Owen had taught her in that cramped kitchen, the words she hadn't understood until now, and why he had believed they mattered so much. Tell me your name. Don't go to sleep. The girl didn't answer at once. A long time passed, so long that Delia was about to ask again. The girl's lips moved twice without making a sound, as though her name lay somewhere very deep inside her and had to be drawn upward one piece at a time. Then she managed to say it. She said her name. Giada. Delia gently tightened her hands around the girl's, nodded, and repeated the name aloud, clearly, so Giada could hear it spoken in another person's voice. Then she gave her own name. She told her, "My name is Delia," and asked Giada to remember it for her. Giada looked at her. Something in those eyes became still for a moment and stopped drifting away. Then the girl said one more thing, so softly that Delia had to bend close to hear it, a sentence Delia would carry with her for the rest of her life. "I forget so many things," the girl said, "but I remember my name." Delia took off Owen's windbreaker and wrapped it around Giada, tying the sleeves across the girl's chest so it wouldn't slip away. Then she lifted those bare feet into her lap and began rubbing them. She used the flat of her palms, gently and steadily, exactly as she had been taught, and kept talking as she worked so the girl would remain awake. She asked questions that didn't need answers. She asked whether Giada was cold and what songs she liked. Giada didn't answer any of them. but her hand began fumbling inside the pocket of her fleece jacket, searching awkwardly, like the hand of someone wearing gloves that were far too thick. At last, she pulled something out and held it forward. Beneath the streetlight, it caught the light in one sharp gleam. It was an old-fashioned ring with a high setting. The stone in the center wasn't large, but its facets were deep, and the platinum band had worn thin along the inside, in the way only a ring worn for several decades ever could. Giada pressed it into Delia's palm and folded Delia's fingers around it. "Take it, Mama," she said. "Buy yourself a warm coat. I forget everything. I don't need it." Delia sat motionless. Her hand closed around the ring, and she felt the cold of the metal, then felt it slowly grow warm inside her palm. Everything passed through her mind with terrible speed and perfect clarity. Nothing was blurred. Every thought was mercilessly precise. She thought of the brown envelopes from the hospital that she had stopped opening the month before. She thought of her belly and of the approaching day she kept trying not to imagine, the day her little girl would be born, and she wondered where that birth would happen. She imagined a room with a roof, a door that locked, a working heater, and a crib. This ring could buy all of that. Not forever, but for long enough. Long enough to carry her through the winter. Long enough that her daughter wouldn't have to begin her life in the same kind of place where her mother was sitting now. And no one would know. That was the worst thought. The one that came last and remained the longest. No one would ever know. By the following day, this girl wouldn't remember. She wouldn't remember that anyone had sat with her here. She wouldn't remember that she had ever owned a ring. Delia's fingers tightened. At that exact moment, a contraction hardened her belly, long and unyielding, and she had to bend forward and breathe through it with one hand braced against the snow. When it passed, she heard Owen's voice in her mind. It wasn't anything profound. It was only what he had said in that kitchen, that before he bandaged anyone, he asked their name first, that people might forget where they hurt. But no one ever forgot how it felt to be called by the right name. Delia raised her head. She opened Giada's hand, placed the ring back in her palm, then folded each frozen finger around it, and held that closed hand tightly between both of her own. "It's yours," she said. "Hold on to it. This is your mother." The fog in Giada's eyes cleared. It didn't last long, only a few seconds, but it truly cleared, and the girl looked directly into Delia's face. She looked at her belly, at the faded uniform, at the cloth bag lying beside her, then back into her eyes. "You need money badly, don't you?" Giada asked. "I can see it. Why didn't you take it?" Delia didn't answer at once. Then she said, "Because what I need can't be bought with money." Giada still had time to open her mouth, as though she meant to say something more. But no words came. Her body collapsed to one side, and Delia understood immediately what was coming. She didn't panic. She caught Giada, turned her firmly onto her left side with quick, decisive movements, then pulled her cloth bag closer, folded it in half, and placed it beneath the girl's head so it wouldn't strike the hard ground. She moved the ring beyond the reach of Giada's hand. She didn't hold her down, didn't pin her, and didn't try to force her mouth open, because all three of those things were wrong, and Delia knew they were wrong. She simply remained there with one hand resting lightly on Giada's shoulder to keep her from rolling, counting silently, slowly, and evenly, exactly as she had been taught, so she could tell a medical professional afterward how long it had lasted. Snow settled over both women. Delia counted through one interval, then another, and then everything grew still. She bent down, placed her ear close, and heard Giada breathing. The girl didn't regain consciousness. Delia raised her head and looked in both directions along the avenue. There was nothing. No headlights, no people, not a single store with its lights still on. And from the confusion spinning inside her mind, she pulled out the only useful thing she still possessed. The one thing Owen had left her besides his coat. The map he had made her memorize when they were newly married, because he said that one day she might need it. She knew where the nearest fire station was. Station number 9. North. Giada came around a little, enough to open her eyes and enough to stand, and Delia didn't wait another second. She slipped her shoulder beneath the girl's arm, wrapped her other arm around her back, and pulled both of them to their feet. She tucked the ring into the inside pocket of Owen's windbreaker, fastened it shut, and whispered into Giada's ear, "Walk with me. Just walk. You don't have to think." They made it some distance that way. Giada's feet moved, but her steps were uneven, and whenever the girl sagged, her entire weight fell against Delia's left hip. Each time it happened, Delia had to tighten her belly to keep her balance, and every time she tightened it, something inside her clenched and then slowly released. She counted their steps. Counting was easier than thinking. After a while, Giada stopped walking. She didn't completely collapse. Her legs simply stopped obeying her, and Delia knew she couldn't support her any farther. She settled Giada against a low wall, then went into the parking lot beside it, where several cars had remained covered with tarps throughout the winter. She chose the nearest tarp, pulled at the cords securing its corners, and used the full weight of her body to tear it loose. She worked with fingers she could no longer feel, pulling again and again until the tarp finally came free, and the force of it sent her falling backward onto the ground. She dragged it over, spread it out, laid Giada on top, folded both sides around the girl's body to cover her completely, then seized the two corners near her head, looped them over her shoulders, and pulled. This way was better. The weight no longer pressed against her belly. It pulled at her shoulders and back instead, and the tarp could slide across the snow. But it was slow. Terribly slow. She managed a dozen or so steps before she had to stop and breathe. Then she started again. And during those pauses, she began to talk. She spoke to the child inside her. "Can you hear me, baby?" she said. "Mama isn't leaving anyone behind. And someday, neither will you." She said the words aloud in a broken voice, repeating them whenever her head began to feel light, because she knew what that lightness meant. At one street corner, she looked up and saw Owen. He stood there in his paramedic uniform with his hands in his pockets, exactly as he used to stand waiting outside the hospital on evenings when his shift ended before hers. He didn't say anything. He only nodded to her once. Delia stared at him for several seconds, then nodded back, lowered her head, and kept pulling. She didn't ask herself whether he was truly there. At that moment, it didn't matter. Giada drifted in and out of consciousness on the tarp, and once she weakly asked where they were going, Delia didn't correct her. Not because she had forgotten that she wasn't anyone's mother, but because she had understood that tonight, the truth wouldn't help this girl. "Home," she said. "Mama is taking you home." Giada fell silent, and she seemed to go to sleep. For the final 3 blocks, the tarp was useless, because the sidewalks had been shoveled into high banks of snow that it couldn't cross. Delia stood staring at one of those banks for a long time. Then she knelt, turned her back to Giada, drew the girl's arms over her shoulders, gripped both wrists tightly with one hand, braced the other against the ground, and stood up. Somehow, she stood. She didn't know how. Through the first block, she could still walk with a rhythm. Through the second, every step became a fall forward that she barely stopped by throwing out one foot. She could no longer feel the cold, and she knew very clearly that no longer feeling cold was the worst sign of all. But there was nothing she could do with that knowledge except keep moving. She repeated what she had said earlier to the child inside her, but this time the words no longer came out clearly. On the third block, her left knee gave way. She managed to turn so she wouldn't fall on top of Giada, and she collapsed onto one side, still refusing to release the girl's wrists. She lay there for a while. Then she rolled over, planted both hands against the ground, hauled Giada onto her back once more, and began to crawl. She crawled forward a little at a time, gaining half an arm's length with every movement, her head bowed, her breathing sounding like someone else's breath beside her. She didn't look ahead to see how far remained. She looked only at her 2 hands and told them to keep going. On the 30th floor of the tower where Delia had been mopping floors earlier that evening, the meeting ended later than expected, and the first thing Massimo did when he stepped into the hallway was turn his phone's ringer back on. The screen lit up and didn't go dark again. Missed calls were stacked one after another, from the house, from the caregiver, from Nico, and from several numbers he didn't recognize. He didn't open the messages. He went straight to his voicemail and listened. Marlene Voss's voice filled the carpeted hallway, trembling and breaking as she said Giada had gone outside, that Marlene had only turned away for a moment, that she had searched around the house and the grounds and called everywhere, and that she didn't know which way Giada had gone. Massimo listened to the entire message. He didn't play it a second time. He walked straight to the elevator, and while it descended, he began making calls. He called Nico first and spoke briefly, without explaining. Then he called the warehouse manager at the docks, the man in charge of the vehicle fleet, 2 men on the north side, and 1 man on the east side. None of the calls lasted longer than 15 seconds. He didn't ask whether anyone was busy. He didn't ask where anyone was, and no one asked him a single question in return. He gave them an address, a name, and told them to search. By the time he reached the parking garage, his men were already taking to the streets. They went out on a night when the entire city was under a travel ban, driving along empty roads where no vehicles were supposed to be, and not one of them questioned it even once. Massimo got behind the wheel and drove himself, then made one more call. He called the man responsible for the Western power grid, someone the Ferraro family had known since his father's time, and ordered him to turn on every streetlight in the Delaware district, including the stretch along the park and all the side streets crossing it. The man on the other end said it couldn't be done. He said the storm had knocked out 2 substations in the north, that the grid was already overloaded, and that adding more power would bring down the entire district. Massimo was silent for several seconds. Then he said, "Turn something else off." He didn't say what should be turned off. He didn't need to. He ended the call and drove out of the garage. 10 minutes later, 4 blocks along Delaware Avenue blazed with light in the middle of the storm, so bright that from above they might have been mistaken for a runway. Somewhere farther west, several neighborhoods abruptly fell into darkness, and no one explained why. Massimo drove slowly with the window lowered, letting the snow strike his face without caring. At every intersection, he stopped, leaned out, and called his sister's name. He called it again and again into an empty street, and nothing answered but the wind. He hadn't thought about it for 3 years, or perhaps he had thought about it every day without allowing it to take shape. But that night, it took shape. That evening, his mother and Giada had waited for him at the restaurant, and he had been caught in a meeting he told himself would take only 40 minutes. He sent the driver to pick them up instead. He remembered typing a message to his mother. He remembered writing that he would be a little late, and he remembered not waiting for her reply. The car never reached its destination. His mother never came home. Giada did, but only part of her returned, and no one had ever been able to recover the part left behind on that bridge. Massimo stopped at an intersection with both hands resting on the steering wheel, and for a while he sat motionless. Then he drove on. His phone vibrated continuously throughout the next several hours. The vehicle team reported back from the Park District. Nothing. The men on the north side had searched all 4 branching streets. Nothing. Nico reported that he had sent men into both closed subway stations. Nothing. Others searched church porches, bus shelters, and the rear yard of the elementary school. Nothing. His men, his cars, his money, an entire city illuminated in defiance of the travel ban. And no one could find Giada. He turned onto the final branch of the Delaware district, the stretch running north, and his headlights swept across the sidewalk to his right. Something was there. It wasn't a person standing, and it wasn't a person lying down. It was a low shadow inching its way along the ground, with another shadow on its back. Massimo slammed on the brakes. The car skidded for a distance, before jerking to a stop at an angle across the middle of the street. In the headlights, the first thing he saw was a patch of fleece, the soft ivory beige he had seen hundreds of times hanging from the coat rack in the front hall of his home, the coat his mother had bought Giada one winter long ago, and that the girl had refused to replace. He opened the car door before the engine had even stopped running. He took 3 running steps before he saw the second thing, and it stopped him in the middle of the street. The person carrying his sister was a woman, and the woman was pregnant. Her belly touched the snow every time she dragged herself forward, and she was bracing both bare hands against the frozen pavement to pull them onward. Massimo dropped to his knees beside them. He didn't have time to decide what he should do first. He reached out to support Giada, and his sister's arm slipped from the woman's shoulder. Then he saw that the woman's hands were still clenched around Giada's wrists, gripping them so tightly that he had to loosen her fingers one at a time. The woman raised her head. Her face was deathly pale. Her hair clung to her forehead, and a streak of dried blood marked her lower lip, where she had bitten it while straining forward. She stared at him for several seconds, before she understood that someone was truly there. Massimo opened his mouth to ask who she was. But she spoke first. And she didn't ask him for help. She didn't say she was cold, didn't say she was exhausted, and didn't utter a single word about herself. Her voice was hoarse and broken by each breath, yet what she said was strangely precise. She told him that Giada had suffered a seizure farther down the street near the park at about 9:40, that it had lasted around 40 seconds and stopped on its own, and that she hadn't regained consciousness afterward. She continued, saying Giada didn't have a fever, that she had checked her forehead and her neck, that there was no smell of alcohol, and that she had checked her breathing twice along the way and found it present both times. Then she looked directly into his eyes and said, "You must tell the doctor exactly that. 9:40. 40 seconds. No fever. No alcohol." Massimo listened to every word and couldn't speak. In his life, he had sat across from men who could buy an entire neighborhood. He had heard the most hardened men in the city speak to him in every imaginable way, and he had never heard anyone use a voice like hers. It wasn't the voice of someone pleading. It was the voice of someone handing over responsibility. He nodded. He said he would remember. The woman heard him, and something inside her let go. She tried to say one more thing. Her lips moved, but this time no sound came. Then her eyes rolled upward, and she fell forward. Massimo reached out in time. He caught her just before her face struck the road, and he sat there in the middle of the street, supporting his sister with one arm and a woman whose name he had never known with the other, while his car continued running behind them and its headlights shone directly upon all three. At the hospital, the two gurneys were wheeled in opposite directions, and Massimo stood in the middle of the hallway, not knowing which one to follow. He followed his sister, and he repeated to the physician on duty exactly what the woman had instructed him to say. Every detail, the time it began, how long it lasted, no fever, no alcohol. He watched the physician write it all down quickly, then look up and ask who had provided the information. Massimo said he didn't know. Nearly an hour later, the physician came out to speak with him, and said his sister was being warmed gradually, and that her condition had improved, but there was something he needed to know. The blood tests showed that the level of anticonvulsant medication in her system was almost 0. The physician asked how long she had been off her medication. Massimo said she hadn't missed a single day, that someone gave her the medication every morning and every evening, and that the routine hadn't been interrupted once since she left the hospital. The physician studied him for a moment, then said something didn't add up and walked away. Massimo remained in that hallway for a long time. He said nothing to anyone. He simply fixed those words in his mind and left them there. As for the other woman, they said she was suffering from severe exhaustion and anemia, and they required her to remain under observation for at least the night. No one told him anything more because he wasn't family, and when they asked whether he was related to her, he said no. Nico arrived close to midnight, carrying a soaking wet cloth bag that someone had found in the street, some distance from where the two women had been discovered. He set it on the plastic chair beside Massimo. Massimo opened it. There wasn't much inside. A few sets of clothing rolled tightly together. A towel, a bottle of vitamins from a free clinic, and an old tin, the kind that once held cookies. He lifted the lid. Inside was a paramedic identification card with worn corners bearing the name of a man, and Massimo knew at once that the man was dead because no one kept the identification card of someone still alive in a box like that. Beneath it was an ultrasound image, then $3.40 in change. Then a $100 bill folded into quarters, smooth and unwrinkled. At the bottom was a cleaning employee identification card with a photograph, a name, an identification number, and the logo of the building he had walked out of earlier that evening. Massimo picked up the card and studied the face printed on it. Then he looked at the neatly folded bill beside it. Only one thought filled his mind. How many times had he walked past this woman? He closed the tin carefully, then held the entire box in his hands. Close to 2 o'clock in the morning, someone called him into his sister's room. Giada was awake, but not in the way anyone had hoped. She bolted upright in bed, tore the tube from her hand, and began to panic. She asked where she was, why she was there, where she had gone, and she asked the questions without stopping, asking them and then repeating the same ones again. Massimo sat on the edge of the bed and held her by both shoulders. He said her name. He told her his own. "Calm down. I'm here. You're safe now." Giada gradually settled. She sat breathing, her eyes lowered to the blanket, and he asked whether she remembered anything. She was silent for a long time. Then she spoke in a small, hazy voice, like someone emerging from a long dream. "There was a woman," she said. "She wouldn't let me fall asleep." Then she lay back down and drifted off. Massimo pulled the blanket over his sister, dimmed the lights, and went out to sit in the hallway. Near dawn, Nico returned carrying a printed sheet of paper. He sat in the plastic chair beside Massimo and read what he had found. The woman's name was Delia Mercer. She was 27 years old, had no relatives listed in any official record, and had grown up in the foster care system. Her husband had been a paramedic who died several months earlier while responding to an accident on the highway, and the insurance company had denied the claim because of an error in his shift record. She owed the hospital for unpaid prenatal care. She worked nights for the cleaning company, contracted to service the tower on the avenue, and the night before, she had been fired. Then Nico paused before reading the final line. At 4 o'clock the previous afternoon, he said. Her landlord had changed the lock on her room. Massimo said nothing for a while. Then he asked for the address. His voice didn't change. It didn't rise or grow colder. It was the same voice he had used when asking the doctor about his sister. Nico folded the paper, slipped it into his inside pocket, and stood. He didn't ask another question. He had taken several steps toward the end of the hallway when a sound came from the room next door. The door had been left slightly open after a nurse came in to check Delia's blood pressure and hadn't yet closed it, and Delia had awakened at some point. No one knew how much she had heard, but it had certainly been enough. She was trying to sit up. She braced one elbow against the mattress, her body trembling with the effort, the intravenous line pulling tight against the back of her hand, and she called out. "Sir!" Massimo turned. Nico stopped as well. Delia had to take several breaths before she could speak. "What are you going to do to him?" she asked. Massimo walked to the doorway and said she didn't need to know, that she should lie down, but she didn't. "He's a terrible man," she said. She said it plainly, without evasion, without softening anything about the man who had put her out on the street in the middle of winter. Then she continued, her voice beginning to break because she didn't have enough breath. "But if something happens to him tonight, I'll be the reason." She said she had lived all those years, passed through all those houses that had never been her home, and lost so many things, yet she had never once been the reason someone else suffered. She said that was the only thing she still had left. Then she looked directly into his eyes and pleaded, "Please don't take that from me too." The hallway fell silent. Somewhere behind them, a machine continued to sound its steady beeping. Massimo stood in the doorway with one hand still resting on the doorknob, and he remained motionless for so long that Nico lowered his eyes to the floor. In his life, people had said every imaginable thing to him inside closed rooms. They had begged him. They had bargained with him. They had promised him things they never intended to honor. But no one had ever lain in a hospital bed. A stranger who didn't know him, owed him nothing, and had nothing to gain, and asked him not to do something simply because it would leave a mark upon her life. He took out his phone and placed a call. Nico heard his own phone ringing inside his pocket and looked up. Massimo said only one word, "Come back." Nico nodded and returned toward the chairs. Massimo entered the room. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked down at the woman struggling to breathe. "Do you know what you just did?" he asked. Delia didn't answer. "You just said no to me," he said. "It's been a very long time since anyone in this city has done that." Delia lay still for several seconds. Then she replied, her voice much weaker now. "Then I suppose it's been a long time since anyone told you the truth." Massimo didn't answer. He looked down at her hand, at the tape holding the intravenous needle in place, at the fingertips that were still purple from the night before. Then he walked around the side of the bed. The blanket had slipped below her waist while she was trying to sit up. He took hold of its edge, pulled it over her, covered her to the chest, then smoothed it flat across her shoulder. He did it without thinking, exactly as he had done for his sister in the room across the hallway several hours earlier. Then he turned and walked out. Nico was waiting outside, and he had seen everything. He said nothing. He simply opened the elevator doors and pressed the button for the ground floor. Marlene Voss arrived at the hospital a little after 8 o'clock in the morning, neatly dressed, her hair carefully combed, carrying a bag of things for Giada that she had packed at home. She apologized to Massimo in the hallway, apologizing in complete, carefully formed sentences, saying she had searched all night and would never be able to forgive herself. Then she asked permission to enter the room, explaining that according to the procedure she always followed, she needed to check Giada's personal belongings to make sure nothing had been lost during admission. The nurse opened the bedside cabinet and took out the patient belongings bag. Marlene opened it and examined each item one by one. Then she straightened, her face drained white. She said the ring wasn't there. She repeated herself, a little louder this time, saying that Rosetta's ring wasn't in the bag. Massimo entered the room. He knew which ring she meant. Everyone in his family knew. It was the only thing Giada still had of her mother, and the one thing she never took off, even on her worst days. Marlene turned the bag upside down and emptied everything onto the table. Then she looked up and said, softly but loudly enough for the people standing in the hallway to hear every word, that there had been only one person with Giada the night before. She didn't give a name. She only called her that homeless cleaning woman. The story spread faster than voices could carry it. The nurse who had opened the cabinet took a step back. The head nurse came over, asked several questions, then used the hospital phone. Within minutes, 2 security guards appeared at the end of the hallway. They didn't do anything. They simply stood there. Someone pulled back the curtain in the neighboring room to watch, and when the nurse entered Delia's room to replace her intravenous bag, her voice was entirely different from the day before. It was shorter and drier, and she no longer asked how Delia was feeling. Delia sat propped against the head of the bed. She had heard everything. People didn't need to speak loudly in a hospital for her to hear them. Marlene entered and stood at the foot of the bed, then asked whether Delia had seen the ring. She asked in the voice of someone who had already decided upon the answer, and was only asking for the sake of appearances. Delia looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't take it." She said it once, neither loudly nor with a tremor. Marlene asked where the ring had gone. Then, she said Giada couldn't have lost it herself, that Giada couldn't remember anything, but she always kept that ring clenched in her hand. Someone in the hallway called in that they should just contact the police and be done with it. Delia turned toward the doorway, where Massimo was standing, and spoke for the second time. "I didn't take it, but I know none of you will believe me." Then she added, even more softly than before, "I'm used to that." No one answered. Marlene turned to Massimo and began speaking without pause, insisting that they had to follow the proper procedure, that if they didn't report it now, the insurance company wouldn't handle it later, that he had to think of Giada, and that this was a keepsake from Rosetta, not merely an object. She spoke rapidly and at length, repeating Rosetta's name 3 times in less than a minute. Massimo didn't answer her. He looked at the woman in the hospital bed. Delia looked directly back at him, never avoiding his gaze for even a second. "Do whatever you believe is right," she said. Then she continued, and her voice changed. It was no longer the voice of someone defending herself. It was the same voice of someone handing over responsibility that he had heard once before on the snowy street the night before. "But if you take me away, please have someone sit beside your sister's bed. She was very frightened last night. When someone wakes up and doesn't know where she is, that's when she's most afraid. All she needs, then, is for someone to sit beside her and call her by the right name. Nothing else." The hallway went completely silent. The 2 security guards remained at the far end, waiting. Marlene opened her mouth to continue, but Massimo raised one hand, no higher than his shoulder. She fell silent. He stood there for several more seconds, looking at the patient belongings bag lying overturned on the table, then turned to Nico and quietly said several words that no one else in the room could hear. Massimo didn't call the police. He did 3 things, and he did them in that exact order. First, he went down to the hospital's administrative office and requested a copy of the patient property inventory completed when Giada was admitted the night before. They printed it for him within about 10 minutes. Every item was listed on the document, and the 3rd line clearly recorded a platinum ring set with a stone, along with the signature of the family member who had verified and accepted the inventory. The signature belonged to Marlene Voss, signed close to midnight after she left the room for the first time. He asked who had the code to open the bedside cabinet. The head nurse replied that only the staff on duty and the registered family member had access, and the only family member listed in Giada's care record was Marlene Voss. Second, he called the technician responsible for his home security system and instructed him to retrieve all the data from the cameras installed throughout the house. Massimo had ordered the system installed after the night on the bridge, installed it out of fear, then forgotten it existed because he had never had a reason to review the recordings. By noon, Nico brought a computer to the hospital hallway. The first recording showed the small kitchen beside Giada's room. Marlene opened the medicine cabinet, took down the dose organizer, and performed a neat, practiced sequence of movements, the kind of skill that could only come from having done the same thing many times before. She emptied the pills from one compartment into a small bottle, slipped it into her pocket, then took white tablets from another bottle and arranged them in the spaces she had just emptied. She closed the organizer and returned it to the cabinet. The entire process took less than a minute. Nico advanced to another recording. It showed the same scene on a different day, then another, then another. Massimo watched every one without saying a word. The 3rd thing happened without any preparation on his part. That afternoon, Giada awoke far more lucid than she had been that morning. and she managed to eat half a bowl of porridge. Massimo sat beside her bed and asked whether she remembered where she had put their mother's ring. Giada nodded immediately. "I gave it to the woman," she said. Massimo asked again to make sure. Giada said she had given the woman the ring and told her to use it to buy a warm coat. Then she continued, speaking as calmly as though she were recounting some small, unimportant thing. "She made me take it back." She even raised her hand and folded her fingers inward, imitating exactly how someone had closed her hand around the ring that night. Massimo remained silent for a long time after that. He had Marlene brought into an empty room at the end of the floor. He didn't shout. He didn't rise from his chair. He merely turned the computer screen toward her, pressed play, and sat silently as she watched. Marlene made it through about half the recording before raising a hand to cover her mouth. She began to talk about her debts, about her younger brother, about things Massimo heard without retaining a single word. Then he asked her only one question. "When you took the girl's medication, who did you sell it to?" Marlene had been crying and speaking without pause, but suddenly she stopped. Then a sentence slipped out, one she herself didn't appear to have intended to say. "I only did what the person paying me told me to do." Massimo looked up. "Who?" Marlene looked at him, and the panic on her face changed into something entirely different, something that resembled fear, but wasn't fear of him. Then she closed her mouth. She didn't say another word. Not when the police arrived, not when they read her rights, and not when they escorted her from the building later that morning. Sometime after noon, a man came to the hospital reception desk asking about Marlene Voss. He wore a gray suit and had silver hair at his temples, and he introduced himself as her legal representative. He didn't speak to Massimo. He merely left a business card with the administrative office and departed. Nico picked up the card, read it, fell silent, then handed it to Massimo. It bore the name of a downtown law firm, and beneath it was the name of the man who had just come, a name known to everyone in the city who had ever been involved in a criminal case, the kind of attorney a person could retain only with a great deal of money and a great many things to hide. Massimo studied the card for a long time. Then he said, his voice no louder than before, "A caregiver can't afford this name." He folded the card between two fingers and handed it to Nico. "Find out who's paying." The search for whoever was paying began in the place Massimo had avoided for 3 years. He told Nico to retrieve the entire file from the accident on the bridge, everything that remained in storage, the scene report, the rescue report, the list of vehicles, and the names of every person who had been there. He ordered it because he believed that if someone had been paying a caregiver to withhold his sister's medication for more than a year, the reason wasn't rooted in the present. It was rooted in that night. The files arrived late the following afternoon, a thick stack of faded copies, many of them stamped for archival storage. Nico sat in the hospital hallway turning through them one page at a time, marking every place where a person's name appeared. Massimo sat beside him, holding nothing, staring out the window. Then Nico's hand stopped. He turned the page over, read it again, then passed it to Massimo. It was the report from the first ambulance crew to reach the scene, recording their arrival time, the initial condition of each person, and the procedures they had performed. In the section concerning the young female victim in the rear seat, one line stated that her airway had been maintained and kept clear until she was transferred to the second ambulance. At the end of that line was the signature of the person who had performed the procedure, with the name printed beside it for clarity. O. Mercer. Massimo held the document for a long time. He looked at the name, then at the door to the hospital room at the end of the hallway, the door he had passed more times than he could count over the last 3 days. That afternoon, he entered Delia's room. She was able to sit up now, and was halfway through a cup of milk the hospital had given her. He said nothing. He merely placed the report on the meal tray spanning her bed, and pushed it toward her. Delia glanced at it, and was about to ask what it was when her eyes stopped at the lower right corner. She set down the cup of milk. She picked up the paper with both hands. She stared at the signature, the handwriting she had seen on hundreds of other pieces of paper throughout the years she had lived beside the man who wrote it, on requests for time off, on their marriage license, on the note taped to the refrigerator reminding her to take her medicine. She couldn't speak, not a single word. She only sat there holding the document, and Massimo watched her hands begin to tremble, so faintly that she had to lower the paper onto the tray to keep it from rustling. At that moment came the sound of slippers at the door. Giada had walked over from her own room, one hand still gripping the doorframe, with a nurse following behind her. She stood there looking at the two of them. then approached the bed and did something neither Massimo nor the nurse had time to stop. She raised a hand to her left wrist and removed the band. The band no one had been able to persuade her to take off for 3 years. The band that sent her into a panic whenever Marlene tried to cut it away. The band the entire family had come to regard as part of her wrist. She placed it on the tray beside the report. Massimo looked down, and he recognized something he had never once examined closely in 3 years. It wasn't a plastic hospital band. It was a strip of wide medical tape, the kind used at an emergency scene, yellowed with age and hardened over time, formed into a loop and sealed at the edge. Faded markers still showed on its surface, blurred but legible. Her name was written there. Beneath it were 2 words in capital letters, written quickly in heavy strokes. Keep awake. Giada spoke as calmly as though she were talking about the weather. Someone wrote this for me, she said. I don't remember his face. I only remember someone asking my name over and over, not letting me go to sleep. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and fell silent. Massimo placed the report beside the strip of tape on the tray. The 2 objects lay together beneath the ceiling light. The same handwriting, the same way the letter E tilted slightly backward, the same crossbar extending too far across the letter T. No one in the room said anything. The nurse in the doorway was silent too. Delia raised one hand to her mouth and held it there. Massimo looked down at the 2 pieces before him, then at the woman in the hospital bed, then at his sister sitting there turning the band in her palm, and he couldn't find a single word to say. On the day Delia was discharged from the hospital, Massimo presented her with a list. He said he would pay her hospital debt, arrange an apartment for her on the north side with reliable heat, and give her enough money that she wouldn't have to worry about finances until after the baby was born. Delia listened to everything, then shook her head. That night, I didn't take your sister's ring, she said. Today, I'm not taking your money either. Massimo asked where she intended to go. She said she would find somewhere, just as she always had. He was silent for a while, then changed his approach. Then I won't give you money, he said. I'll hire you. He said his sister needed someone to sit with her every day, someone who knew what to do when she had a seizure, who knew what to say when she awoke and couldn't remember where she was. And in the entire city, he knew only one person capable of doing that. He said there would be a contract, a salary, and a probationary period. And if Delia couldn't do the work, he would dismiss her as he would anyone else. Delia sat in silence for a long time. Then she said she would sign. The position had a name she chose herself, Memory Companion, and it began with a soft-covered notebook purchased from the grocery store at the end of the street. She taught Giada to write in it every evening. Not her feelings, only facts, the date, people's names, what had happened, and then to read it again from the beginning, the following morning. She told Giada that memory didn't live inside the mind. Memory lived wherever a person chose to keep it. During those same weeks, Massimo established a foundation bearing his mother's name. The Rosetta Foundation supported night shift workers and families caring for loved ones with neurological injuries, and he placed Delia in charge of a program helping caregivers renew their professional certifications, because she was the only person in the meeting room that day who knew what it felt like to lose a certification simply because she couldn't afford to renew it. Then, one night in early February, Delia went into labor sooner than expected. The car sped through the darkness, and on the way to the hospital, she seized Massimo by the sleeve and made him listen until she had finished. Mr. Ferraro, I grew up in homes that were never mine. Every time they moved me, someone mispronounced my name. If I don't make it, don't let my little girl travel that same road. You only need to find her one person who will remember her name, that's all. Massimo told her she would make it. She told him to promise. He promised. In the waiting room, a nurse carrying a clipboard came out and asked what his relationship was to the patient. Massimo stood there for a long time, so long that the nurse had to ask again. Then he said, I'm nothing to her. I'm only someone who owes her a debt. The nurse looked at him for a second, wrote something on the clipboard, and went back inside. He sat in the row of chairs outside the hallway and remained there until morning, calling no one, answering no calls, his fingers laced together over his knees. The baby girl arrived earlier than expected, tiny, and they placed her in a heated nursery. She was breathing steadily. That was the first thing the doctor told him when he came over, and Massimo repeated those 3 words inside his mind several times. Giada refused to leave. She pulled a chair beside the glass and remained there all night, singing the same song over and over. the only song left in her mind from the years when her mother was alive, singing softly and getting the words wrong in the same place every time. Delia survived. She awoke the following morning, and the first thing she asked about was the name. She named her daughter Josie. Over the days that followed, the baby gained weight, and Giada recorded it in her notebook each day as though writing down good news. It was during that week that the neurologist overseeing Giada's care called Massimo and Delia into his office and told them something neither had ever considered. He said Giada had never mistaken Miss Mercer for her mother. He said what remained inside her from the night on the bridge wasn't an image or a face. It was a voice asking her name and telling her not to fall asleep, and the human mind preserved things like that longer than anything else. He asked Delia what she had said to Giada first on the night of the snowstorm. Delia repeated the exact words. "Tell me your name. Don't go to sleep." The doctor nodded. "That's it," he said. "She didn't run to you because she was confused. She ran to you because the part of her mind that remains recognized the sound of safety." Giada sat in the corner of the room, took out her notebook, and wrote those words down herself. Then she read them aloud for everyone in the room to hear. He came one afternoon in early May, when Josie had grown stronger, and Delia had become accustomed to holding her baby in one arm while preparing materials for the Foundation's training program with the other. He called ahead, asked permission, and arrived precisely on time. Ezra Vance was past 60, with neatly combed silver hair and a warm voice, and he possessed the kind of courtesy found in people who had spent so long in conference rooms that politeness had become a reflex rather than an effort. He didn't enter the house. He sat at the table on the porch, asked about the baby's health first, asked whether she slept well, and he asked those questions like a man who genuinely wanted to know. Then he placed a thin packet of documents on the table. He didn't push it toward Delia. He simply set it down and left it there. He said he knew she owed the hospital money, and he gave the exact amount down to the last cent. He said he knew she rented her home month by month, and that the landlord had announced an increase beginning in the fall. He said he knew she hadn't opened a savings account for her daughter, because doing so required an initial deposit she didn't have. He said all of this not as a threat, but in the measured voice of someone laying out a situation for another person to examine beside him. Then he opened the packet. Inside was a check for $250,000, already signed. There were documents for a 3-bedroom house in another state, where the winters were far shorter than they were here. There was an educational trust in Josie Mercer's name, fully funded through college, and there was a letter confirming that Delia's entire hospital debt would be paid within 7 days. Ezra said the condition was simple. She would leave her position at the Foundation, take her child away, and stop encouraging Giada to write in that notebook. He added that the notebook wasn't good for Giada, that doctors could say whatever they wished. But he had watched the girl grow up and knew that dragging things out of her mind would only cause her more pain. He said it very gently. Then he placed a pen beside the check. Delia picked up the pen. She truly held it, not merely for appearances. The last time, in the snow, she had refused a ring when she was the only person in the world she had left to protect. This time was different. This time, a baby slept inside the house in a crib Delia had bought from a neighbor, and she knew the precise value of everything lying on that table. She knew how many years free from worry it could buy, how many nights of lying awake and calculating it could erase. She sat in silence for a long time, turning the pen in her hand. Ezra didn't rush her. He remained silent too, looking out at the garden and allowing time to do its work, because he knew that in matters like this, silence carried more weight than words. Then Delia set the pen down. She asked him a question. She asked whether he had a daughter. Ezra seemed slightly surprised, but he answered that he did. One daughter who now had a family of her own. Delia nodded. "Then answer this for me," she said. "If I sign these papers, what am I supposed to tell my daughter 20 years from now when she asks where the money for her education came from?" Ezra didn't answer. Delia pushed the packet toward him, the check, the trust agreement, the confirmation letter, all of it. "I've slept on the street," she said. "I know what hunger feels like. I know how hungry a person has to become before she stops feeling hungry at all. But I've never spent a night lying awake and wondering whom I sold so I could eat." Ezra remained seated for a while longer. Then he gathered the documents carefully, arranged them into a neat stack, thanked her for her time, wished the baby strong and healthy growth, and rose to leave. He didn't say another word. Delia didn't tell Massimo about the visit, but he learned of it anyway. because 2 days later, during a call about the foundation's paperwork, Ezra himself mentioned it casually. He said he had visited Miss Mercer, that she was a woman of principle, and he spoke in the voice of a man dropping a pebble into water to see how far the ripples would travel. Massimo ended the call without replying. That afternoon, he went to the foundation's offices. He stood in the doorway of Delia's office and looked inside, where she sat feeding her baby while her free hand continued turning through a file on her lap. He remained there for about half a minute. Then he turned away without knocking and without saying a word. It began in a place no one in the Ferraro household could see. At the detention center, Marlene Voss was permitted to make scheduled phone calls, and she called Ezra Vance, not to ask for help, but to bargain. She told him that the Mercer woman was making Giada write in a notebook every day, that Giada could now remember things from the week before, and that only recently she had read an entry aloud in front of her doctor. Marlene said she merely wanted to remind him that she was sitting in there alone, and she hoped he hadn't forgotten her. She had no idea what she had just set in motion. Ezra ended the call, and that very afternoon, he began to work. Not in the way men like Massimo worked, but in the way of a man who had spent his entire life in rooms filled with records. He took out Rosetta Ferraro's old will, the one she had signed when Giada was still very young, naming him as her daughter's legal godfather. He retrieved Giada's latest neurological evaluation, which stated that Giada Ferraro suffered from cognitive impairment and couldn't make important decisions for herself. Then, he produced a third document, one Massimo himself had placed into his hands, the notice stating that the financial activities connected to the Ferraro shipping group were under federal review. He combined those three things into an emergency guardianship petition, arguing that a brother who was the subject of an investigation wasn't fit to care for an incapacitated person and that the urgency of the circumstances required an immediate temporary order. He filed the petition late Wednesday afternoon. The court granted the temporary order Thursday morning. Massimo had no idea the game had begun. He learned at 6:20 that morning, when vehicles stopped outside the gates and Nico pounded on his bedroom door. 3 vehicles were already in the courtyard. One was a white van bearing the name of a private care facility in the suburbs. The other 2 were police cruisers. A man carrying a document case approached, presented the order, read its case number aloud, named the court, and read the name of the person appointed as guardian. Massimo took the document and read it from beginning to end. He read slowly, including all the fine print on the back. Then he said, "I'm her biological brother." The man said yes, and explained that Massimo had the right to challenge the order through the proper procedure, that a review hearing would be scheduled, and that until then, the order remained in effect. Massimo called his attorney. The attorney listened for 2 minutes, then said there was no way to stop it that morning, that a temporary order could be overturned only through another hearing, and that the earliest possible hearing was still several days away. Massimo called 2 more numbers, 2 men whom everyone in the city knew could make things happen. Both gave him the same answer. "This is a court order." Giada was brought downstairs close to 7 o'clock. She wore her coat and held the notebook tightly against her chest. She didn't understand what was happening, and she kept asking her brother, over and over, whether she had done something wrong. Massimo stepped toward her. A police officer extended one arm to block him, very politely, never touching him, merely placing himself between them. "Please keep your distance until the transfer is complete," the officer said. And Massimo Ferraro, the man whose name made an entire city lower its voice, the man whose single phone call could extinguish the lights across a whole neighborhood, stood fewer than 3 steps from his sister and wasn't permitted to touch her. He stood there. He didn't shout. He did nothing. His hands hung at his sides, closing into fists and then opening again. Delia stood on the rear steps holding Josie, and she saw everything. They led Giada to the van, opened the door, and seated her in the middle row. The door closed. The vehicle didn't leave immediately because the transfer documents still had to be signed. While they waited, Giada turned and looked outside. She opened her notebook, flipped to the final page, and pressed it flat against the window, holding it there. The pencil marks were shaky and hurried, the letters larger than usual. 4 words. Uncle Ezra. The bridge. Massimo was looking down as he signed the documents someone had placed before him. Nico was making a phone call. The police officers stood with their backs to the van. Only Delia saw it. She froze on the steps, tightening her arms around the baby, and the page remained pressed against the glass for several more seconds before the white van began to move, turned around, and disappeared through the gates. Delia told Massimo about those 4 words the moment the white van disappeared from sight. He listened, and he didn't say that they had evidence now, because he knew better than anyone that the words of someone the court had just declared legally incapacitated would mean nothing to anyone. But those 4 words gave him a direction. That afternoon, he summoned his attorney and asked only one question. What would it take to bring down a man like Ezra Vance? The attorney said they needed the money trail. He said they had to prove where the money paid to Marlene Voss had come from, and to do that, they would have to open the corporation's entire set of books to the prosecutors without withholding anything, including the parts Massimo himself didn't want anyone to see. Most of the old financial records, the originals from his father's time and the years that followed, were kept in his mother's private safe in her second-floor study. He hadn't opened that safe once since the day of her funeral. He had stood before it several times and rested a hand against its cold steel surface, but each time he had walked away. That night, he opened it. He entered the sequence of numbers his mother had recited to him only once, many years earlier, and when the door opened, the smell of old paper drifted out. There was no money inside, no gold. There were only records arranged in bundles, tied with string, with each year written in pencil along the spine. He removed them one by one and laid them across the desk. In the final and most recent bundle, he found a handwritten journal belonging to his mother. Its pages were covered on both sides with lines she had written for herself, small and orderly. He read, and during the half-hour he sat at that desk, everything he believed he had understood about the past 3 years was overturned. His mother hadn't merely been someone standing behind the person in power. She had been the one in power, truly in power, even while his father was still alive, and the meetings Massimo had assumed she attended only for appearances had actually been chaired by her. On the final pages, she had recorded every transaction, how the money moved through trust accounts, the names of the firms, and the dates. She had discovered that Ezra Vance had been draining the family trust for years, and near the end, she wrote that she had arranged to meet the other 2 board members the following week to present the matter and remove him. That following week never came. Massimo sat motionless. He understood then that on the night of the bridge, the people in the other vehicle hadn't been waiting for him. For 3 years, he had lived with the belief that his mother had gone in his place, that she had died because he had been occupied for 40 minutes. That wasn't true. She was the person they needed. He had merely created a reason to torment himself. Beneath the journal lay an unsealed envelope containing a half-finished letter, only half a page written before it stopped. Massimo, if you're reading this, then I didn't have time to finish what I began. Don't seek revenge. Live with decency. That's the only way I win. There was nothing more. No signature. He folded the letter and remained seated for a long time. Then he rose, walked to the lowest shelf of the bookcase, and took out a worn leather notebook, the book containing names he had never once needed to use in his life. He called Nico. Nico didn't ask anything. 10 minutes later, a car was running in the courtyard with 4 men seated inside. Massimo put on his coat, took the leather notebook, and went downstairs. Delia stood at the foot of the staircase, blocking the way to the door. She wasn't holding her baby. She had placed Josie somewhere in the house before coming out there, which meant she had known in advance that she would be standing in his path. She didn't plead. She didn't tell him not to go. She looked at the leather notebook in his hand, then raised her eyes to his face. If you go tonight, tomorrow people will say your sister was rescued by a criminal. Massimo stood there. Do you know what I'll lose if I do this your way? He asked. Delia said she knew. Then she said, that night, I had nothing left either, and I still carried her for 9 blocks. Losing everything won't kill you, Mr. Ferraro, but becoming the thing you hate will. The car's engine continued running steadily outside. Massimo looked down at the notebook in his hand. Then he placed it on the cabinet at the foot of the stairs, and he never picked it up again. The 4 words on the notebook page pressed against the glass only told him where to dig, and what he unearthed wasn't anyone's memory at all. It was money moving through accounts. In the final pages of his mother's notebook was the name of a trust account, and when his lawyer traced that name, it revealed a chain of regular payments stretching back more than a year, every month on the same day, for the same amount, transferred into an account under the name Marlene Voss. That trust had been created, signed, and managed by Ezra Vance himself. That was the real evidence, but to use it, they had to submit it, and to submit it, They had to turn over the place where it had been found, which meant the corporation's entire set of books. All of it, with nothing held back. Nico listened, then sat in silence for a very long time before he finally spoke. He said, "Boss, you understand that if you open that up, you won't be the only one who goes down," he said. "3 generations of this family are tied up in there. Your father, your grandfather, and you," he said. "You'll lose everything." Massimo answered that the last time he had chosen to keep everything, and he had lost his mother. He said this time he was choosing the opposite. He met Ezra Vance one final time in that same second-floor office, beside the safe that had already been opened. Ezra arrived on time, as always, polite as always, and before he sat down, he still asked how little Josie was doing. Massimo pushed 3 folders across the desk. The first contained copies of the monthly transfer orders. The second held the trust account records bearing Ezra's signature. The third was Rosetta's notebook, already open to the final pages. Ezra read. He read slowly, without rushing, and his face didn't change until he reached the 3rd page of the notebook, where Rosetta had written down the week when she had arranged to meet the other 2 members of the board. That was when he lowered the papers. He said, "Do you remember that I was the one who carried you out of the church on the day you were baptized?" Massimo said he remembered. Ezra said, "I gave the eulogy at your mother's funeral." Massimo said, "I sat in the front row. I heard every word." Then he went on, his voice still as quiet as it always was, the same voice that had once made 4 men in a harbor basement hold their breath just to hear him. He said, "I know what you're waiting for me to do. You're waiting for me to do what a Ferraro man is supposed to do. So tomorrow morning people will have something to talk about. So my little sister's name will be tied to it for the rest of her life." He said, "I won't do it." He said, "Everything here, yours and mine, will be on a federal prosecutor's desk tomorrow morning." Ezra asked, "Do you understand what you're doing to yourself?" Massimo said yes. Then he said one last thing. He said, "For 3 years, how much money did you spend making sure that girl didn't remember? You bought the people who watched her. You bought her medication. You even bought a court order." Then he said, "But she wrote your name in pencil, in a notebook she bought at the little store at the end of the block." He said, "You lost to a notebook that cost $2, Uncle Ezra." Ezra didn't answer that. He stood, fastened the button on his jacket, and walked out. And that was the last time he ever crossed the threshold of the Ferraro house. The rest belonged to paperwork and to rooms with the national flag standing in the corner. Ezra Vance was indicted, the guardianship order was revoked, and Giada was brought home on a July afternoon, carrying the notebook she hadn't let out of her hands for a single day during all that time. Most of Massimo's assets were seized, and he received a prison sentence. On the evening before he was required to report, he went to the foundation house. Josie was already asleep. Delia was sitting at the kitchen table, and around her neck, the thin chain holding Owen's wedding ring rested where it did every day. Massimo stood across the table from her. He said he had finished making arrangements for Giada and had signed the papers so Delia could make every decision concerning the girl while he was away. Then he fell silent for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not asking you to take that ring off." He said, "Your husband saved my sister." He said, "I'll never ask you to forget him." Then he said, "I'm only asking you to let me come back, no matter how long it takes." Delia didn't answer with words. She stood, walked into the other room, carried the sleeping Josie back out, and placed the little girl in his arms. By the following winter, Delia was still living in the little house on the Ferraro estate, still waking before 6 o'clock, still running the Rosetta Foundation's Caregiver Certification Retraining Program, a program that had helped dozens of people return to the profession that year. Most of them women who had lost their certifications for reasons almost exactly like hers. Josie had learned to walk, had learned to pull herself upright by gripping the legs of a chair, and Giada was fully mobile again, able to go out into the garden by herself, make her own tea, and sit down every evening to write in her notebook, writing with the same steady regularity with which other people took medicine. And she had now reached her 3rd notebook. On a late autumn afternoon, a man came to the gate of the foundation house, carrying a little girl in his arms. He stood there for quite a while before pressing the bell. He said he had once worked the same shift as Owen Mercer. Then, for nearly a full minute, he couldn't say anything else. Finally, he managed one sentence. Only one. He said that on that night, Owen had traded shifts with him so he could get to the hospital in time to see his daughter being born. Delia stood in the doorway with one hand braced against the frame, and in that instant, she understood the thing she had read over and over again for so many months on the insurance company's denial letter without ever truly understanding it. The error in the shift record. The line of small print. Owen had died on the way to the scene during a shift that, according to the paperwork, he hadn't been assigned to work, and because of that, his wife and child hadn't received a single cent. He had died because he was kind, and that very kindness was what had taken away everything that should have been left for her. Delia invited the father and daughter inside. She made tea. She asked the little girl's name, and she asked in the gentlest voice she had. Then, on that morning, a clear and bitterly cold winter morning, the gates of the prison on the east side of the city opened. Massimo Ferraro stepped outside. No suit, no tie, only an ordinary cloth coat that had been returned to him along with his bag of personal belongings. There was no black car waiting at the curb. There was no one walking behind him. He stopped for 1 second beyond the gate, squinting against the sunlight, and then he saw her. Delia stood across the street with her hands on a stroller. She didn't run toward him. She waited for him to walk the entire distance between them. When he reached her, she took something from her coat pocket and placed it in his palm. A $100 bill, folded into quarters, smooth, worn with age. She said, "This belongs to you." She said, "I've kept it for you far too long." Massimo looked at the bill in his hand, and he couldn't say a word. On the way home, Delia told him to stop at the tower on the avenue. He didn't ask why. The two of them walked into the lobby, the polished stone lobby that reflected the ceiling itself in the daylight. Near the middle of the lobby, an older woman was pushing a cleaning cart, dressed in a faded blue-gray uniform, exactly the same kind of uniform Delia had once worn. People entering and leaving walked around her, around the cart, around the patch of water she had just cleaned, around her the way people walked around a pillar. Delia pushed the stroller closer, then bent down until she was at eye level with the woman. She said, "Hello, ma'am." She said, "My name is Delia." Then she asked, "What's your name?" The woman looked up. She froze for exactly 1 second, one hand still wrapped around the mop handle, and in that single second her eyes filled with red. Then she said her name. She said it very softly, as though no one had asked her that question in a very long time, and as though she were afraid that if she spoke too loudly, people would stop listening again. Delia repeated the name aloud, clearly, so the woman could hear it coming from someone else's mouth. Massimo stood behind her, then stepped forward, lowered himself too, and for the first time in his life, he used that question the way she did. People don't become poor because they lack money. They become poor when no one sees them anymore. That night, a woman who had nothing left in her hands gave away something an entire powerful family couldn't buy: presents. Kindness isn't something we give when we have more than enough. It's the one thing we still have when we've lost everything. If you pass someone today whom no one seems to see, please stop for 3 seconds and ask their name. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone you think needs to hear it. How do you feel about Delia and about that winter night? Please leave a comment. We read every single word, and we truly hope to hear what comes from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, joyful days, and peace beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next story.